am Peace. Welcome to my channel, where stories hit different and every page comes to life.
The Stoker. As Carl Rossman, a boy of 16 who had been packed off to America by his poor parents because a servant girl had seduced him and got herself a child by him, stood on the liner slowly entering the harbor of New York, a sudden burst of sunshine seemed to illumine the Statue of Liberty, so that he saw it in a new light, although he had sighted it long before. Her arm with its sword rose up as if newly stretched aloft, and around her figure blew the free winds of heaven. So high, he said to himself, and since he was not thinking at all of getting off the ship, was gradually pushed to the railing by the swelling throng of porters shoving past. A young man with whom he had struck up a slight acquaintance on the voyage called out in passing, "Not very eager to go ashore, are you?" "Oh, I'm quite ready," said Carl with a laugh, and, being both strong and in high spirits, he heaved his trunk onto his shoulder. But as his eye followed his acquaintance, who was already moving on with the others, casually swinging a cane, he realized with dismay that he had forgotten his umbrella down below. He hastily begged his acquaintance, who did not seem particularly pleased, to do him the favor of keeping an eye on the trunk for a minute, made a quick survey of the situation to be sure he could find his way back, and hurried away. Below decks, he was distressed to find that a gangway that would have made a handy shortcut had been barred for the first time in his experience, probably to facilitate the disembarkation of so many passengers, and he had to find his way painfully down an endless series of little stairways, through corridors with countless turnings, through an empty room with a deserted writing table, until, in the end, since he had taken this route no more than once or twice, and always among a crowd of other people, he got completely lost. In his bewilderment, meeting no one and hearing nothing but the ceaseless shuffling of thousands of feet above him, and in the distance, like faint breathing, the last throbbings of the engines which had already been shut down, he began, without any hesitation, to pound on a little door before which he had chanced to stop in his wanderings. "It isn't locked," a voice shouted from inside, and Carl opened the door with genuine relief. "What are you hammering at the door for, like a madman?" asked a huge man, scarcely even glancing at Carl. Through an opening of some kind in the ceiling, a feeble glimmer of daylight, all that was left after the upper decks had used most of it up, fell into the wretched cubbyhole in which a bunk, a cupboard, a chair, and the man stood packed together as if they had been stored there. "I've lost my way," said Carl. "I never noticed it during the voyage, but this is a terribly big ship." "Yes, you're right there," said the man with a certain pride, fiddling all the time with the lock of a little sea chest and pressing down its lid with both hands in the hope of hearing the bolt snap shut. "But come inside," he went on. "What do you want to stand out there for?" "I'm not disturbing you?" asked Carl. "Now, how could you disturb me?" "Are you a German?" Carl asked to reassure himself further, for he had heard a deal about the perils that threatened newcomers to America, particularly from the Irish. "That's what I am, all right," said the man. Carl still hesitated. Then the man suddenly seized the door handle and, pulling the door shut with a swift movement, swept Carl into the cabin. "I can't stand being stared at from the passage," he said, beginning to fiddle with his chest again. "People keep passing and staring in. It's more than a man can stand." "But there's no one out there," said Carl, who was standing squeezed uncomfortably against the end of the bunk. "Yes, not now," said the man. "But it's now we're speaking about," thought Carl. It's hard work talking to this man. "Lie down on the bunk, you'll have more room there," said the man. Carl scrambled in as well as he could and laughed aloud at his first unsuccessful attempt to swing himself over. But scarcely was he in the bunk when he cried, "Oh my God, I've completely forgotten about my trunk." "Well, where is it?" "Up on deck. Someone I know is looking after it. What's his name again?" And he fished a calling card from a secret pocket that his mother had made in the lining of his jacket for the voyage. "Butterbalm, Franz Butterbalm." "Is your trunk really all that important?" "Of course it is." "Well then, why did you leave it in the hands of a stranger?" "I forgot my umbrella down below and ran off to get it. I didn't want to drag my trunk with me. Then on top of that, I got lost." "You're all alone? Without anyone to look after you?" Yes, all alone. Maybe I should join up with this man, the thought came into Carl's head. Where am I likely to find a better friend? And now you've lost your trunk as well, not to mention the umbrella. And the man sat down on the chair as if Carl's situation had at last acquired some interest for him. But I don't think my trunk is lost yet. You can think whatever you like, said the man, vigorously scratching his dark, short, thick hair. But morals change every time you come to a new port. Maybe in Hamburg your friend Butterbaum might have looked after your trunk. Here it's almost a sure thing that they've both disappeared. Then I have to go up and see about it right away, said Carl, looking around for the way out. You just stay where you are, said the man, shoving him quite roughly with one hand against his chest so that he fell back on the bunk again. Why should I? Asked Carl in exasperation. Because there's no point in it, said the man. I'm leaving very soon myself, and we can go together. Either your trunk has been stolen and there's nothing you can do about it, or else the man has left it standing where it was, and then we'll find it all the more easily when the ship is empty. And the same with your umbrella. Do you know your way around the ship? Asked Carl suspiciously, and it seemed to him that the idea, otherwise plausible, that his things would be easier to find when the ship was unloaded must have a catch to it somewhere. Well, I'm the ship's stoker, said the man. You're the stoker, cried Carl, overjoyed, as if this revelation surpassed all his expectations, and he rose up on his elbow to look at the man more closely. Just outside the cabin I shared with the Slovak, there was a little window through which we could see into the engine room. Yes, that's where I worked, said the stoker. I've always been so interested in machinery, said Carl, following his own train of thought. And I would have become an engineer in time, that's certain, if I hadn't had to go to America. Well, why did you have to go? Oh, that, said Carl, dismissing the whole story with a wave of the hand. He looked with a smile at the stoker, as if begging his indulgence even for what he was not ready to admit. There was some reason for it, I'm sure, said the stoker, and it was hard to tell whether in saying that he wanted to encourage or discourage Carl to tell him about it. I could become a stoker now too, said Carl. It doesn't matter to my father and mother what happens to me now. My job's going to be free, said the stoker, and as if to emphasize the point, he stuck both hands into his trouser pockets and flung his legs, in their wrinkled, leathery, iron-grey trousers, on the bunk to stretch them. Carl had to move closer to the wall. Are you leaving the ship? Yes, we're packing up today. But why? Don't you like it? Oh, that's just the way things are. It doesn't always depend on whether a man likes it or not. But you're quite right. I don't like it. I don't suppose you're thinking seriously of being a stoker, are you? Because that's just the time you can most easily turn into one. I strongly advise you against it. If you wanted to study engineering in Europe, why don't you study it here? The American universities are really a lot better than the European ones. That's possible, said Carl, but I have hardly any money to study on. I once read about someone who worked all day in a shop and studied at night until he got his doctorate, and became a mayor too, I think. But that calls for a lot of perseverance, doesn't it? I'm afraid I haven't got that in me. Besides, I wasn't a particularly good student. It really didn't bother me to leave school, and maybe the schools here are even more difficult. I can hardly speak any English at all. Anyhow, people here have a prejudice against foreigners, I think. So you've learned about that already too, have you? Well, that's all to the good. You're the man for me then. Listen here. This is a German ship we're on. It belongs to the Hamburg American line. So why aren't the crew all Germans, I ask you? Why is the chief engineer a Romanian? A man called Schubal. It's hard to believe it. A measly dog like that, slave driving us Germans on a German ship. You mustn't think. Here he ran out of breath and gesticulated with one hand. That I'm complaining just for the sake of complaining. I know you have no influence and that you're only a poor young kid yourself. But it's too much. And he slammed the table several times with his fist, never once taking his eyes from it. I've served on so many ships already. And he reeled off 20 names one after the other as if they were one word. It made Carl's head spin. And I've done great work on all of them. I've been praised, I've pleased every captain I ever had, actually stuck to the same cargo boat for several years. I did. He rose to his feet as if that had been the high point of his life. And here on this tub, where everything's done by rule and you don't need any brains at all, here I'm no good. Here I'm just in Schubel's way. They say I'm a slacker who doesn't begin to earn his pay and should be kicked out. Can you understand that? I can't. You shouldn't put up with it, said Carl excitedly. He had almost lost the feeling that he was on the uncertain boards of a ship beside the coast of an unknown continent. So much at home did he feel here in the stoker's bunk. Have you seen the captain about it? Have you asked him to give you your rights? Oh, go on, get out of here. I don't want you here. You don't listen to what I say, and then you give me advice. How am I supposed to get to see the captain? Warily, the stoker sat down again and hid his face in his hands. I can't give him any better advice, Carl told himself, and he realized that it would have been better all along for him to go and get his trunk instead of handing out advice that was only regarded as stupid. When his father had given him the trunk for good, he had said in jest, "How long will you hang on to it?" And now that faithful trunk had perhaps really been lost after all. His only consolation was that his father could hardly learn of his present situation, even if he were to make inquiries. All that the shipping company could tell him was that he had safely reached New York. But Carl felt sorry to think that he had hardly begun to use the things in the trunk, although, to take just one example, he should long since have changed his shirt. So his economies had started at the wrong point, it seemed. Now, at the very beginning of his career, when it would be essential to present himself in clean clothes, he would have to appear in a dirty shirt. Otherwise, the loss of the trunk would not have been so serious, for the suit he was now wearing was actually better than the one still packed away, which was in fact merely an emergency suit that his mother had hastily mended just before he left. Then he remembered that in the trunk there was a piece of Verona salami that his mother had packed as an extra tidbit, only he had not been able to eat more than a bite of it, for during the voyage he had been quite without any appetite, and the soup that was dished out in steerage had been more than sufficient for him. But now he would have liked to have the salami on hand, so he could present it to the stoker. For such people were easily won over by the gift of some trifle or other. Carl had learned that from his father, who slipped cigars into the pockets of the subordinate functionaries with whom he did business, and so won them over. Yet all that Carl now had in the way of possible gifts was his money, and he did not want to touch that for the time being, in the event that he really had lost his trunk. Again his thoughts turned back to the trunk, and he simply could not understand why he should have watched it so vigilantly during the voyage that he had practically lost sleep over it, only to let that same trunk be filched from him so easily now. He remembered the 5 nights during which he had kept a suspicious eye on a little Slovak, whose bunk was 2 places away from him on the left, and who had designs, he was sure, on the trunk. This Slovak was merely waiting for Carl to be overcome by sleep and doze off for a minute, so that he could maneuver the box away with a long, pointed stick, which he was always playing or practicing with during the day. By day, the Slovak looked innocent enough, but hardly did night come on than he kept rising up from his bunk to cast melancholy glances at Carl's trunk. Carl had seen this quite clearly, for every now and then someone would light a little candle, though it was forbidden by the ship's regulations, and with the anxiety of the emigrant would strain to decipher the incomprehensible prospectus of some emigration agency or other. If one of these candles was burning near him, he could doze off for a little, but if it was farther away or if the place was quite dark, he had to keep his eyes open. The strain of this task had quite exhausted him, and now perhaps it had all been in vain. Oh, that butter balm, if ever he met him again. At that moment, the unbroken silence was disturbed by a series of small, short taps in the distance, like the tapping of children's feet. They came nearer, growing louder, until they sounded like the tread of quietly marching men. They were evidently proceeding in single file, as was natural in the narrow passage, and a clatter as of weapons could be heard. Carl, who had been on the point of relaxing into a sleep free of all worries about trunks and Slovaks, started up and nudged the stoker to draw his attention, for the head of the procession seemed just to have reached the door. "That's the ship's band," said the stoker. "They've been playing up above and have come back to pack up. All's clear now and we can go. Come on!" He took Carl by the hand, at the last moment snatched a framed picture of the Madonna from the wall above his bed, stuck it into his breast pocket, grabbed his sea chest, and hastily left the cabin with Carl. "I'm going up to the office now to give them a piece of my mind. All the passengers are gone. I don't have to worry about what I do." The stoker kept repeating this theme with variations, and as he walked, he kicked out sideways at a rat that crossed his path, but only succeeded in driving it more quickly into its hole, which it reached just in time. He was slow in all his movements, for though his legs were long, they were massive. They went through part of the kitchen where some girls in dirty aprons, which they seemed to splash deliberately, were washing dishes in large tubs. The stoker hailed a girl called Lena, put his arm around her waist, and as she snuggled up against him coquettishly, led her part of the way with him. "It's payday. Aren't you coming along?" he asked. "Why bother? You can bring me the money here," she replied, squirming out from under his arm and running away. "Where did you pick up that pretty boy?" she cried after him, but without waiting for an answer. They could hear the laughter of the other girls who had all stopped working, but they went on and came to a door above which there was a little pediment, supported by small gilded caryatids. For a ship's fitting, it looked extravagantly sumptuous. Carl realized that he had never been in this part of the ship, which during the voyage had probably been reserved for passengers of the first and second class. But the doors that cut it off had now been thrown open to prepare for the cleaning of the ship. Indeed, they had already met some men with brooms on their shoulders who had greeted the stoker. Carl was amazed at the extent of activity on the ship. As a steerage passenger, he had seen very little of it. Along the corridors ran electrical wires, and a little bell kept ringing continuously. The stoker knocked respectfully at the door, and when someone cried, "Come in," he urged Carl with a wave of his hand to enter boldly. Carl stepped in, but remained standing just inside the door. The three windows of this room framed a view of the sea, and gazing at the cheerful motion of the waves, his heart beat faster, as if he had not been looking at the sea without interruption for 5 long days. Great ships crossed each other's courses in all directions, yielding to the assault of the waves only as far as their ponderous weight permitted. If one squinted, these ships seemed to be staggering under their own weight. From their masts flew long, narrow pennants which, though kept taut by the speed of their going, at the same time fluttered a little. Salvos could be heard, probably from some battleship, and a warship of some kind passed at no great distance. The barrels of its guns, gleaming with the reflection of sunlight on steel, seemed to be nursed along by the sure, smooth, not quite even-keeled motion. Only a distant view of the smaller ships and boats could be had, at least from the door, as they darted about in swarms through the gaps between the great ships. And behind them all rose New York. Its skyscrapers stared at Carl with their 100,000 eyes. Yes, in this room one realized where one was. At a round table, 3 gentlemen were sitting, one a ship's officer in the blue ship's uniform, the 2 others harbor officials in black American uniforms. On the table lay piles of various papers, which the officer first glanced over, pen in hand, and then handed to the 2 others, who read them, made excerpts, and filed them away in portfolios. Except when one of them, who was constantly making an odd little noise with his teeth, dictated something or other to his colleague. By the first window, a little man was sitting at a desk with his back to the door. He was busy with some huge ledgers lined up on a sturdy bookshelf on a level with his head. Beside him stood an open safe, which, at first glance at least, seemed to be empty. The second window was not obscured and offered the best view. But near the third, 2 gentlemen were standing conversing in low tones. One of them was leaning against the window. He also wore the ship's uniform and was playing with the hilt of his sword. The man to whom he was speaking faced the window, and now and then a movement of his disclosed part of a row of decorations on the chest of his interlocutor. He was in civilian clothes and carried a thin bamboo cane which, as both his hands were resting on his hips, also stood out like a sword. Carl did not have much time to study all this, for almost at once an attendant came up to them and asked the stoker, with a glance that seemed to indicate that he had no business here, what he wanted. The stoker replied as softly as he had been asked that he wished to speak to the head purser. The attendant made a gesture of refusal with his hand, but all the same tiptoed toward the man with the ledgers, avoiding the round table by a wide detour. The ledger official, this could clearly be seen, stiffened immediately at the words of the attendant, but at last turned toward this man who wished to speak to him and waved him away violently, repudiating the attendant too, just in order to make everything quite plain. The attendant then sidled back to the stoker and said in a confidential tone, "Clear out of here at once." At this reply, the stoker turned his eyes to Carl, as if Carl were his heart, to which he was silently imparting his woe. Without stopping to think, Carl launched himself straight across the room, actually brushing against one of the officer's chairs, while the attendant chased after him, swooping with widespread arms as if to catch an insect. But Carl was the first to reach the head purser's desk, which he gripped firmly in case the attendant should try to drag him away. The whole room naturally sprang to life at once. The ship's officer at the table leapt to his feet. The harbour officials looked on calmly but attentively. The two gentlemen by the window moved closer to each other. The attendant, who thought it was no longer his place to interfere since his masters were now involved, stepped back. The stoker waited tensely by the door for the moment when his intervention should be required. And the head purser at last made a complete right-about turn in his chair. From his secret pocket, which he was perfectly willing to reveal to these people, Carl pulled out his passport, which he opened and laid on the desk in lieu of further introduction. The head purser seemed to consider the passport irrelevant, for he flicked it aside with 2 fingers, whereupon Carl, as if that formality were satisfactorily settled, put it back in his pocket again. "May I be allowed to say," he then began, "that in my opinion an injustice has been done to the stoker? There's a certain Schubel aboard who is giving him a hard time. He has a long record of satisfactory service on many ships, all of whose names he can give you. He is diligent, takes an interest in his work, and it's really hard to see why on this particular ship, where the work isn't as heavy as on cargo boats, for instance, he should get so little credit. It can only be sheer slander that keeps him back and robs him of the recognition that should certainly be his. I have confined myself, as you can see, to generalities. He can lay his specific complaints before you himself." Carl had addressed this speech to all the gentlemen present, because in fact they were all listening to him, and because it seemed much more likely that among so many at least one just man might be found, than that the one just man should happen to be the head purser. Carl also cleverly concealed the fact that he had known the stoker for such a short time. But he would have made a much better speech had he not been distracted by the red face of the man with the bamboo cane, which was now in his line of vision for the first time. "It's all true, every word of it," said the stoker before anyone even asked him, indeed before anyone so much as looked at him. This over-eagerness on his part might have proved a great mistake if the man with the decorations, who it now dawned on Carl was of course the captain, had not clearly made up his mind to hear the case. For he stretched out his hand and called to the stoker, "Come here," in a voice as hard as an anvil. Everything now depended on the stoker's behaviour, for about the justice of his case Carl had no doubt whatever. Luckily, it appeared at this point that the stoker was a man of some worldly experience. With exemplary composure, he drew out of his sea chest at the first attempt a little bundle of papers and a notebook, walked over with them to the captain as if that were a matter of course, entirely ignoring the head purser, and spread out his evidence on the window ledge. There was nothing for the head purser to do, but also to come forward. "The man is a notorious grumbler," he said in explanation. "He spends more time in the pay room than in the engine room. He has driven Schubel, who's a quiet fellow, to absolute desperation. Now you listen to me." Here he turned to the stoker. "You're really much too persistent in pushing yourself forward. How often have you had to be booted out of the pay room already? And it serves you right too for your impudence in demanding things to which you have absolutely no right. How often have you gone running from the pay room to the purser's office? How often has it been patiently explained to you that Shubal is your immediate superior and that it's him you have to deal with and him alone? And now you actually come here when the captain himself is present and dare to pester him with your impudence. And as if that weren't enough, you bring along a trained mouthpiece to reel off the stupid grievances you've drilled into him, a young boy I've never even seen on this ship before. Carl had to restrain himself from springing forward, but the captain had already intervened with the remark. Better hear what the man has to say for himself. Shubal's getting a good deal too big for his boots these days, but that doesn't mean I think you're right. The last words were addressed to the stoker. It was only natural that the captain should not take his side at once, yet everything seemed to be going the right way. The stoker began to state his case, and from the very beginning controlled himself to the point where he even referred to Shubal as Mr. Shubal. Standing beside the head purser's vacant desk, Carl felt so pleased that in his delight he kept pressing the letter scales down with his finger. Mr. Shubal was unfair. Mr. Shubal was prejudiced in favor of foreigners. Mr. Shubal ordered the stoker out of the engine room and made him clean toilets, which was not a stoker's job at all. At one point, even the competence of Mr. Shubal was called into question as being more apparent than real. At this point, Carl fixed his eyes on the captain and stared at him with earnest deference, as if they had been colleagues, to keep him from being influenced against the stoker by the man's awkward way of expressing himself. All the same, nothing definite emerged from the stoker's outpourings, and although the captain still listened thoughtfully, his eyes expressed his resolve to hear the stoker out this one time to the very end. The other gentlemen were growing impatient, and soon the stoker's voice no longer dominated the room, a bad sign. The gentleman in civilian clothes was the first to show his impatience by toying with his bamboo cane and tapping it, though only softly, on the floor. The others still looked up now and then, but the two harbour officials, who were clearly pressed for time, snatched up their papers again and began, though somewhat distractedly, to glance over them. The ship's officer turned back to his desk, and the head purser, who now thought he had won the day, heaved a loud, ironic sigh. The only one who seemed to be exempt from the general dispersion of interest was the attendant, who sympathised to some extent with this poor fellow confronting these great men, and gravely nodded to Carl as though trying to explain something. Meanwhile, outside the windows, the life of the harbour went on. A flat barge laden with a mountain of barrels, which must have been wonderfully well secured to keep them from rolling around, went past, almost completely obscuring the daylight in the room. Little motorboats, which Carl would have liked to examine closely if he had had time, shot straight past in obedience to the slightest touch, word for word unchanged, of the man standing erect at the wheel. Here and there, curious objects bobbed independently out of the restless water, were immediately submerged again and sank before his astonished eyes. Boats belonging to the ocean liners were rowed past by sweating sailors. They were filled with passengers sitting silent and expectant, as if they had been stowed there like freight, except that some of them could not refrain from turning their heads to gaze at the changing scene. Activity without end, restlessness transmitted from the restless element to helpless human beings and their works. But everything demanded haste, clarity, precision. And what was the stoker doing? He was talking himself into a sweat. His hands were trembling so much that he could no longer hold the papers he had laid on the window ledge. From all points of the compass, complaints about Shubal streamed into his head, any one of which, it seemed to him, should have been sufficient to dispose of Shubal for good. But all he could produce for the captain was a pathetic hodgepodge in which everything was jumbled together. For a long time, the man with the bamboo cane had been staring at the ceiling and whistling to himself. The harbour officials now detained the ship's officer at their table and showed no sign of ever letting him go again. The head purser was clearly restrained from letting fly only by the captain's composure. The attendant stood at attention, waiting every moment for the captain to give an order concerning the stoker. Carl could no longer remain inactive, so he advanced slowly toward the group, running over in his mind all the ways in which he could most adroitly handle the situation. It was certainly high time. Just a little longer, and both of them might well be kicked out of the office. The captain might indeed be a good man, and might also, or so it seemed to Carl, have some particular reason at the moment to show that he was a just master, but he was not, after all, a mere instrument to be recklessly played on. And that was exactly how the stoker was treating him in the boundless indignation of his heart. So Carl said to the stoker, "You must put things more simply, more clearly. The captain can't do justice to what you are trying to tell him. How can he know all the mechanics and errand boys by name, let alone by their first names? So when you mention so-and-so, how can he understand who you're talking about? Take your grievances in order. Tell the most important ones first and the lesser ones afterward. Maybe it won't even be necessary to mention most of them. You always explained them clearly enough to me. If trunks can be stolen in America, one can surely tell a lie now and then as well," he thought in self-justification. But was his advice of any use? Might it not already be too late? To be sure, the stoker stopped speaking when he heard the familiar voice, but his eyes were so blinded with tears, of wounded dignity, of dreadful recollections, of extreme grief, that he could hardly even recognize Carl. How could he at this point? Carl silently realized this, facing the now silent stoker. How could he suddenly change his style of argument when it seemed plain to him that he had already said all there was to say without evoking the slightest sympathy, and at the same time that he had said nothing at all and could hardly expect these gentlemen to listen to the whole rigmarole all over again? And at such a moment, Carl, his sole supporter, has to break in with so-called good advice, which merely makes it clear that everything is lost. Everything. If only I had spoken sooner, instead of looking out of the window, Carl told himself, dropping his eyes before the stoker and letting his hands fall to his sides as a sign that all hope was gone. But the stoker mistook the gesture, sensing, no doubt, that Carl was nursing some secret grudge against him, and with the good intention of talking him out of it, crowned all his other offences by starting to wrangle at this moment with Carl. At this very moment, when the men at the round table were completely exasperated by the senseless babble that disturbed their important labours, when the head purser was gradually beginning to find the captain's patience incomprehensible and was just on the point of exploding, when the attendant, once more entirely within his master's sphere, was measuring the stoker with savage eyes, and when, finally, the gentleman with the bamboo cane, whom even the captain eyed now and then in a friendly manner, already quite bored by the stoker, indeed disgusted by him, had pulled out a little notebook and was obviously preoccupied with quite different thoughts, glancing first at the notebook and then at Carl. "Yes, I know," said Carl, who had difficulty turning aside the torrent which the stoker now directed at him, yet was still able to summon up a friendly smile for him in spite of all dissension. You're right. I never doubted it for a minute." In his fear of being struck by the stoker's gesticulating hands, he would have liked to catch hold of them, and still better, to force the man into a corner so as to whisper a few soothing, reassuring words to him which no one else could hear. But the stoker was quite out of control. Carl now actually began to take a sort of comfort in the thought that if things got serious, the stoker could overwhelm the 7 men in the room with the very strength of his desperation. But on the desk, as he could see at a glance, there was a signal board with far too many buttons. The mere pressure of one hand on them would raise the whole ship and call up all the hostile men that filled its passageways. But at this point, in spite of his air of bored detachment, the gentleman with the bamboo cane came to Carl and asked, not very loudly, yet clearly enough to be heard above the stoker's ravings, "Tell me, what is your name?" At that moment, as if someone behind the door had been waiting to hear this remark, there was a knock. The attendant looked over at the captain. The captain nodded. Thereupon the attendant went to the door and opened it. Outside stood a middle-sized man in an old military coat, not looking at all like the kind of person who might work with machinery, and yet he was Shubal. If Karl had not guessed this from the expression of satisfaction that lit up all eyes, even the captain's, he must have recognized it with horror from the demeanor of the stoker, who clenched his fists at the ends of his outstretched arms with a vehemence that made the very clenching of them seem the most important thing about him, to which he was prepared to sacrifice everything else, his life. All his strength was concentrated in his fists, including the very strength that held him upright. And so here was the enemy, fresh and carefree in his shore leave outfit, a ledger under his arm, probably containing a record of the stoker's wages and his working papers. He was openly scanning the faces of everyone present, a frank admission that his first concern was to discover on which side they stood. All 7 of them were already his friends, for even though the captain had raised certain objections to him earlier, or had at least pretended to do so because he felt sorry for the stoker, it was now apparent that he had not the slightest fault to find with Shubal. A man like the stoker could not be too severely reprimanded, and if Shubal were to be reproached for anything, it was for not having subdued the stoker's recalcitrance sufficiently, since the fellow had the gall to confront the captain this very day. Yet it might still be assumed that the confrontation of Shubal and the stoker would achieve, even before a human tribunal, the result that would have been awarded by divine justice, since Shubal, even if he were good at making a show of virtue, might easily give himself away in the long run. A brief flare-up of his evil nature would suffice to reveal it to these gentlemen, and Karl would see to that. He already had pretty good knowledge of the shrewdness, the weaknesses, the moods of the various individuals in the room, and in this respect, the time he had spent there had not been wasted. It was a pity that the stoker had not been more competent. He seemed completely incapable of doing battle. If one were to hand Shubal over to him, he would probably split the man's detested skull with his fists, but it was beyond his power to take the couple of steps needed to bring Shubal within reach. Why had Karl not foreseen what so easily could have been foreseen, that Shubal would inevitably put in an appearance, if not of his own accord, then by order of the captain? Why had he not outlined a precise battle plan with the stoker when they were on their way here, instead of simply walking in, hopelessly unprepared, as soon as they found a door, which was what they had done? Was the stoker even capable of uttering a word by this time, of answering yes and no, as he must do if he were to be cross-examined, although, to be sure, a cross-examination was almost too much to hope for now. There he stood, his legs a-sprawl, weak in the knees, his head slightly raised, and the air flowing in and out of his open mouth as if the man had no lungs to control its motion. But Karl himself felt stronger and more clear-headed than he had perhaps ever been at home. If only his parents could see him now, fighting for justice in a strange land before men of authority, and though not yet triumphant, dauntlessly resolved to win the final victory. Would they revise their opinion of him? Set him between them and praise him? Look into his eyes at last, these eyes so filled with devotion to them. Ambiguous questions, and this the most unsuitable moment to ask them. I have come here because I believe this stoker is accusing me of some sort of dishonesty. A maid in the kitchen told me she saw him on his way here. Captain, and all you other gentlemen, I am prepared to show you papers to disprove any such accusation, and thus spoke Shubal. It was, to be sure, a clear and manly statement, and from the altered expression of the listeners, one might have thought they were hearing a human voice for the first time after a long interval. They certainly did not notice the holes that could be picked even in that fine speech. Why, for instance, had the first relevant word to occur to him been dishonesty? Should he, in fact, have been accused of that instead of nationalistic prejudice? A maid in the kitchen had seen the stoker on his way to the office, and Shubal had immediately divined what that meant. Wasn't it his own guilty conscience that had sharpened his apprehension? And he had immediately collected witnesses, had he, and then called them unprejudiced and uncorrupted to boot? A fraud, nothing but a fraud. And these gentlemen were not only taken in by it, but regarded it with approval? Why had he allowed so much time to elapse between the kitchen maid's report and his arrival here? simply in order to let the stoker weary the gentleman until they began to lose their powers of clear judgment, which Shubal feared most of all. Standing for a long time behind the door, as he must have done, had he deliberately refrained from knocking until he heard the casual question of the gentleman with the bamboo cane, which gave him grounds to hope that the stoker was finally finished and done for. The whole thing was obvious, and Shubal's very behaviour involuntarily corroborated it, but it would have to be proved to these gentlemen by other and still more palpable means. They must be shaken up. Now then, Carl, quick, make the best of every minute you have before the witnesses pour in and confuse everything. At that very moment, however, the captain waved Shubal away, and, at once, seeing that his case seemed to be temporarily postponed, he stepped aside and was joined by the attendant, with whom he began a whispered conversation involving many side glances at the stoker and Carl, as well as all sorts of vigorous gestures. It was as if Shubal were rehearsing his next fine speech. "Didn't you want to ask this youngster something, Mr. Jacob?" said the captain in the general silence to the gentleman with the bamboo cane. "Indeed I did," replied the other, with a slight bow in acknowledgement of the captain's courtesy. And he asked Carl again, "What is your name?" Carl, who thought that his main business would be best served by satisfying his stubborn questioner as quickly as possible, replied briefly, without introducing himself by means of his passport, which he would have had to tug out of his pocket. "Carl Rossmann." "Well," said the gentleman who had been addressed as Jacob, taking a step backward with an almost incredulous smile on his face. Likewise, the captain, the head purser, the ship's officer, even the attendant, all displayed an excessive astonishment on hearing Carl's name. Only the harbour officials and Shubal remained indifferent. "Well," repeated Mr. Jacob, walking a little stiffly up to Carl, "then I'm your Uncle Jacob, and you're my own dear nephew. I suspected it all the time," he said to the captain before embracing and kissing Carl, who silently submitted to everything. "And what may your name be?" asked Carl when he felt himself released again, very courteously but quite coolly, trying hard to estimate the consequences which this new development might have for the stoker. At the moment, there was nothing to indicate that Shubal could extract any advantage from it. "Try to understand your good fortune, young man," said the captain, who thought that Mr. Jacob was wounded in his dignity by Carl's question, for he had retired to the window, obviously to conceal from the others the agitation on his face, which he also kept dabbing with a handkerchief. "It is Senator Edward Jacob, who has just revealed himself to be your uncle. You now have a brilliant career before you, against all your previous expectations, I dare say. Try to realize this as far as you can in the first shock of the moment, and pull yourself together." "I certainly have an Uncle Jacob in America," said Carl, turning to the captain. "But if I understood correctly, Jacob is the family name of this gentleman." "That is so," said the captain expectantly. "Well, my Uncle Jacob, my mother's brother, had Jacob for a Christian name, but his family name must, of course, be the same as my mother's, and her maiden name was Bendelmeyer." "Gentlemen," cried the senator, coming forward in response to Carl's explanation, quite cheerful now after his recuperative retreat to the window. Everyone except the harbour officials burst into laughter, some as if really touched, others for no visible reason. "But what I said wasn't so ridiculous as all that," thought Carl. "Gentlemen," repeated the senator, "against my will and against yours, you are involved in a little family scene, and so I can't avoid giving you an explanation, because as far as I know, no one but the captain here." This reference was followed by a reciprocal bow. "Is fully informed of the circumstances." "I really have to pay attention to every word now," Carl told himself, and glancing over his shoulder, he was happy to see that life had begun to return to the figure of the stoker. "During the many years of my sojourn in America, though sojourn is hardly the right word to use for an American citizen, and I am an American citizen with all my heart, for all these many years then, I have lived completely cut off from my relatives in Europe for reasons which, in the first place, do not concern us here, and in the second, would really cause me too much pain to relate. I actually dread the moment when I may be forced to explain them to my dear nephew, for some frank criticism of his parents and their circle will be unavoidable, I'm afraid. It's my uncle, no doubt about it, Carl told himself, listening eagerly. He must have changed his name. Now, my dear nephew was simply thrown out. We may as well call a spade, was simply thrown out by his parents, just as you throw a cat out of the house when it annoys you. I have no intention of glossing over what my nephew did to merit that punishment, yet his transgression was of a kind that merely needs to be mentioned to find indulgence. That's not too bad, thought Carl, but I hope he won't tell the whole story. Anyhow, he can't know much about it. Who would tell him? For he was, Uncle Jacob went on, bracing himself with the bamboo cane and making little bouncing motions that helped to make the situation a good deal less solemn than it would otherwise have been. For he was seduced by a servant, Johanna Brummer, a person of about 35. It is far from my wish to offend my nephew by using the word seduced, but it is difficult to find another equally suitable word. Carl, who had moved quite close to his uncle, turned around to read in the gentlemen's faces the impression the story had made. None of them laughed. All were listening patiently and seriously. After all, one doesn't laugh at the nephew of a senator at the first opportunity. It was rather the stoker who now smiled at Carl, though very faintly, but that was in the first place a pleasure to see, as a sign of his reviving spirits, and excusable in the second place, since in the stoker's bunk, Carl had tried to make an impenetrable mystery of the very story that was now being made so public. Now, this Brummer woman, Uncle Jacob went on, had a child by my nephew, a healthy boy who was baptized Jacob, evidently in honor of my unworthy self, since my nephew's doubtless quite casual references to me must nevertheless have made a deep impression on the woman. Fortunately, let me add, for the boy's parents, to avoid paying alimony or being personally involved in any further scandal, I must point out that I know nothing about the laws of their state, nor anything about their personal circumstances. To avoid the scandal, then, and the payment of alimony, they packed off their son, my dear nephew, to America, shamefully unprovided for, as you can see. And the poor lad, despite the signs and wonders which still happen in America if nowhere else, would have come to a wretched end in some back alley of New York, being thrown entirely on his own resources, if this servant girl hadn't written a letter to me, which after long delays reached me the day before yesterday, giving me the whole story, along with a description of my nephew and, very wisely, the name of the ship as well. If I were setting out to entertain you, gentlemen, I could read a few passages to you from this letter. He pulled out and flourished before them 2 huge, closely written sheets of letter paper. You would certainly be impressed, for the letter is written with somewhat simple but well-intended cunning and with much loving concern for the father of the child. But I have no intention either of entertaining you for longer than my explanation needs, or of wounding at the very start the perhaps still sensitive feelings of my nephew, who, if he likes, can read the letter for his own instruction in the seclusion of the room already waiting for him. But Carl had no feelings for that girl. Hemmed in by an ever-receding past, she sat in her kitchen beside the counter, resting her elbows on top of it. She looked at him whenever he came to the kitchen to get a glass of water for his father or do some errand for his mother. Sometimes, awkwardly sitting sideways at the counter, she would write a letter, drawing her inspiration from Carl's face. Sometimes she would sit with one hand over her eyes, impervious to anything that was said to her. Sometimes she would kneel in her tiny room next to the kitchen and pray to a wooden crucifix. Then Carl would feel shy if he passed by and caught a glimpse of her through the crack of the slightly opened door. Sometimes she would race around the kitchen and jump back, laughing like a witch, if Carl got in her way. Sometimes she would shut the kitchen door after Carl entered and hold it shut until he had to beg to be let out. Sometimes she would bring him things he did not even want and press them silently into his hand. Summary of omitted explicit scene. The woman grew increasingly obsessed with Carl, cornering him in her room and expressing her affection in a way that frightened and overwhelmed him. He escaped in tears, confused and unsettled by the encounter. And so the cook had also been thinking about him and had informed his uncle of his arrival. That had been very good of her, and someday he would repay her for it if he could. And now, cried the senator, I want you to tell me openly whether I am your uncle or not." "You are my uncle," said Karl, kissing his hand and receiving a kiss on the brow. "I'm very glad to have found you, but you're mistaken if you think my father and mother never speak kindly of you. And besides that, you've got some points quite wrong in your speech. What I mean to say is that it didn't all happen like that in reality. But you can't really be expected to understand these things at such a distance, and I also think it won't do any great harm if these gentlemen are somewhat incorrectly informed about the details of something which really can't be of much interest to them." "Well spoken," said the senator, leading Karl up to the captain, who was clearly sympathetic, and asking, "Haven't I got a splendid nephew?" "I am delighted," said the captain, making the sort of bow which only those trained in the military can carry off, "to have met your nephew, Senator. My ship is honoured to have provided the setting for such a reunion. Undoubtedly, the voyage in steerage must have been very unpleasant. But how are we to know who might be travelling with us down below? We do everything possible to make conditions tolerable, far more, for instance, than the American lines do. But to turn such a passage into a pleasure cruise is more than we've been able to manage yet." "It did me no harm," said Karl. "It did him no harm," repeated the senator, laughing loudly. "Except that I'm afraid I've lost mine." And with that he remembered all that had happened and all that remained to be done, and he looked around him and saw the others still in their same places, silent with respect and surprise, their eyes fixed upon him. Only the harbour officials, so far as one could tell from their stern and self-satisfied faces, betrayed some regret at having come at such an unpropitious time, and the pocket watch they had laid on the table before them was probably more important to them than everything that had happened or might still happen there in that room. The first to express his sympathy, after the captain, was curiously enough the stoker. "I congratulate you heartily," he said, and shook Karl's hand in a way that was also meant to express something like gratitude. Yet when he turned to the senator with the same words, the senator drew back, as if the stoker were exceeding his rights, and the stoker immediately desisted. But the others now saw what was expected of them, and at once pressed in a confused throng around Karl and the senator. And so it happened that Karl even received Schubal's congratulations, accepted them, and thanked him for them. The last to advance in the ensuing lull were the harbour officials, who spoke a few words in English, which made a comical impression. The senator, now perfectly in the mood to extract the last ounce of enjoyment from the situation by refreshing his own and the others' minds with some less important details, was not merely tolerated but welcomed with interest by everyone. So he told them that he had entered in his notebook, for quick consultation should the occasion arise, his nephew's most distinctive physical features as enumerated by the cook in her letter. During the stoker's insufferable rantings, he had pulled out the notebook simply to distract himself, and had begun, for his own amusement, to compare the cook's descriptions, which were naturally not those of a professional detective, with Karl's appearance. "And that's how to find a nephew," he concluded proudly, as if he wanted to be congratulated all over again. "What will happen to the stoker now?" asked Karl, ignoring his uncle's last remarks. In his new circumstances, he thought he was entitled to say whatever came into his mind. "The stoker will get what he deserves," said the senator, "and what the captain considers to be right. I think we have had enough, more than enough, of the stoker, a view in which every gentleman here will certainly concur. But that's not the point. It's a question of justice," said Karl. He was standing between his uncle and the captain, and perhaps influenced by his position, thought that he was holding the balance between them. And yet the stoker seemed to have abandoned hope. He had thrust his hands halfway into the belt of his trousers, which, together with a strip of checked shirt, had come prominently into view during his excited tirade. That did not worry him in the least. He had displayed the misery of his heart. Now they might as well see the rags that covered his body, and then they could drag him away. He had concluded that the attendant and Schubal, as the two least important men in the room, would do him that last kindness. Schubal would have peace then, and no longer be driven to desperation, as the head purser had put it. The captain could take on crowds of Romanians. Romanian would be spoken all over the ship, and then perhaps things would really improve. There would be no more Stoker to pester the head office with his ravings, yet his last outburst would be remembered almost fondly, since, as the senator expressly declared, it had been the indirect cause of his recognizing his nephew. The nephew himself had several times tried to help him, and thus had already more than repaid him for his services in the recognition scene. It did not even occur to the Stoker to ask anything more from him now. Besides, even if he were the nephew of a senator, he was far from being a captain yet, and it was from the captain's mouth that the dire verdict would fall. And having reached these conclusions, the Stoker did his best not to look at Carl, though unfortunately in that room full of enemies, there was no other resting place for his eyes. "Don't misinterpret the situation," said the senator to Carl. "This may be a question of justice, but at the same time, it's a question of discipline. On this ship, both of these, and most especially the latter, are entirely within the discretion of the captain." "That's right," muttered the Stoker. Those who heard him and understood smiled uneasily. "But we have already obstructed the captain for too long in his official duties, which must be piling up considerably now that he has reached New York, and it's high time we left the ship instead of adding to our sins by interfering quite unnecessarily in this petty quarrel between two mechanics, and thus making something important of it. I understand your attitude perfectly, my dear nephew, but that very fact justifies me in hurrying you away from here immediately. I shall have a boat lowered for you at once," said the captain, without for a moment taking exception to the senator's words, which surprised Carl greatly, since his uncle could be said to have humbled himself. The head purser rushed hastily to his desk and telephoned the captain's order to the boatswain. "There's hardly any time left," Carl told himself, "but I can't do anything without offending everybody. I really can't desert my uncle now, just when he's found me. The captain is polite, certainly, but that's all. When it comes to discipline, his politeness disappears, and my uncle certainly told him what he felt. I don't want to speak to Schubal. I'm sorry that I even shook hands with him. And all the other people here are of no consequence." With these thoughts in mind, he slowly went over to the Stoker, pulled the man's right hand out of his belt, and held it playfully in his. "Why don't you say something, dear friend?" he asked. "Why do you put up with everything?" The Stoker merely knitted his brow, as if he were seeking the right words for what he had to say. While doing this, he looked down at his own hand and Carl's. "You've been treated unjustly, more than anyone else on this ship. I am positive of that." And as Carl drew his fingers back and forth with the Stoker gazed around with shining eyes, as if blessed by a great happiness that no one could begrudge him. "Now you must get ready to defend yourself. Answer yes and no, else these people won't have any idea of the truth. You must promise me to do what I tell you, for I'm afraid, and with good reason, that I won't be able to help you anymore." And then Carl burst out crying and kissed the Stoker's hand, taking that rough and almost lifeless hand and pressing it to his cheek like a treasure that he would soon have to give up. But now his uncle the senator was at his side and gently yet firmly led him away. "The Stoker seems to have bewitched you," he said, giving the captain a knowing look over Carl's head. "You felt lonely, then you found the Stoker, and you're grateful to him now. That's all to your credit, I'm sure. But if only for my sake, don't push things too far. Learn to understand your position." Outside the door, a hubbub had arisen. Shouts could be heard. It sounded even as if someone were being brutally pushed against the door. A sailor entered in a somewhat disheveled state with a girl's apron tied around his waist. "There's a mob outside," he cried, thrusting out one elbow as if he were still pushing his way through the crowd. Finally, he pulled himself together and was about to salute the captain when he noticed the apron, tore it off, threw it on the floor and shouted, "That's disgusting! They've tied a girl's apron on me!" Then he clicked his heels together and saluted. Someone began to laugh, but the captain said sternly, "This is a fine state of affairs. Who is out there?" "It's my witnesses," said Schubal, stepping forward. "I respectfully beg your pardon, sir, for their bad behavior. The crew sometimes get a little wild when they've reached port." "Once," the captain ordered. Then immediately turning to the senator, said politely but hastily, "Now please be good enough, Senator, to take your nephew and follow this man who will conduct you to your boat. I need hardly say what a pleasure and honor it has been for me to make your personal acquaintance. I only wish, Senator, that I may have an early opportunity to resume our interrupted talk about the state of the American fleet, and that it may again be interrupted in as pleasant a manner." "One nephew is quite enough for me, for the time being," said Carl's uncle, laughing, "and now accept my best thanks for your kindness and goodbye. Besides, it isn't altogether impossible that we," he put his arm warmly around Carl, "might see quite a lot of you on our next voyage to Europe." "That would give me great pleasure," said the captain. The two gentlemen shook hands with each other. Carl barely touched the captain's hand in silent haste, for the latter's attention was already engrossed by the 15 people who were now being shepherded into the room by Shubal, somewhat chastened, but still noisy enough. The sailor asked the senator's permission to lead the way and opened a path through the crowd for him and Carl, so that they passed with ease through ranks of bowing figures. It seemed that these good-natured folk regarded the quarrel between Shubal and the stoker as a joke, and not even the captain's presence could make them take it seriously. Carl noticed among them the kitchen maid Lena, who with a cheerful wink at him was now tying around her waist the apron which the sailor had flung away, for it was hers. Still following the sailor, they left the office and turned into a small passage that brought them in a couple of steps to a little door, from which a short ladder led down to the boat that was waiting for them. Their conductor leapt down into the boat with a single bound, and the sailors in the boat rose and saluted. The senator was just warning Carl to be careful how he came down, when Carl, as he stood on the top rung, burst into violent sobs. The senator put his right hand under Carl's chin, drew him close, and caressed him with his left hand. In this posture, they slowly descended step by step and, still clinging together, entered the boat, where the senator found a comfortable place for Carl, immediately facing him. At a sign from the senator, the sailors pushed off from the ship and at once began rowing at full speed. They were scarcely a few yards from the ship when Carl made the unexpected discovery that they were on the side of the ship toward which the windows of the office looked out. All 3 windows were filled with Shubal's witnesses, who saluted and waved in the most friendly way. Even Uncle Jacob waved back, and one of the sailors showed his skill by flinging a kiss up to the ship without interrupting the regular rhythm of his rowing. It was now as if there were really no stoker at all. Carl took a more careful look at his uncle, whose knees were almost touching his own, and doubts came into his mind whether this man would ever be able to take the stoker's place. And his uncle evaded his eyes and stared at the waves on which their boat was tossing.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to stay tuned.